The day my parents threw my suitcase onto the front lawn and changed the locks, I thought my life was over. All because I refused to break up with Jake, the mechanic they deemed beneath our family. Little did they know, 6 months later, that same poor guy would be signing papers to inherit a $50 million empire. But this story isn't about money or revenge. It's about discovering who really has your back when everything falls apart. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. My name is Madison Clark, and I grew up in Westfield, Connecticut, in one of those pristine neighborhoods where every lawn is perfectly manicured and every family drives luxury cars. My father, Richard Clark, owns 3 successful dental practices across the state, and my mother, Patricia, spends her days organizing charity galas and managing the family's social calendar. To them, appearances were everything, and their daughter, dating a guy who worked with his hands, was apparently the ultimate embarrassment. I met Jake Morrison on the most mundane Tuesday afternoon in September. My BMW had broken down on Route 9, steam pouring from under the hood like a small volcano. I was already running late for my marketing class at the University of Connecticut, and my day was rapidly spiraling into disaster. That's when his tow truck pulled up behind me, hazard lights flashing. Jake stepped out wearing oil-stained coveralls and work boots, his dark hair slightly tousled from the wind. He had this easy smile that immediately put me at ease, even though I was stressed beyond belief. Most guys I knew would have made some condescending comment about women and cars, but Jake just asked what happened and got straight to work diagnosing. "The problem. Looks like your radiator gave up the ghost," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. "I can tow you to Morrison's Auto Shop downtown. We'll get you sorted out." Morrison's Auto Shop turned out to be this cramped but spotlessly organized garage on Elm Street, tucked between a laundromat and a small diner. Jake's uncle Tony ran the place, and from the moment I walked in, I could see this was a family business built on genuine care for their customers. While Jake worked on my car, his uncle brought me coffee and insisted I sit in the small office rather than wait outside. "Jake's the best mechanic we've got," Tony told me, his Brooklyn accent thick with pride. "Kids have magic hands when it comes to engines. Could probably work anywhere he wanted, but he stays here with family." What struck me most was how Jake refused to overcharge me. When I asked about the bill, he just shrugged and said, "Radiator replacement, couple hours of labor, nothing fancy." The total came to less than half what I'd expected, and when I tried to tip him, he waved me off. "Just glad I could help," he said, handing me back my keys. "Drive safe, Madison." I should have driven straight home, but something made me linger. Maybe it was the way he remembered my name, or how he'd taken the time to explain exactly what had gone wrong with my car, instead of just fixing it and sending me on my way. We ended up talking for another hour, sitting on the bench outside the shop as the sun set over downtown Westfield. Jake told me he'd grown up in the small apartment above the garage with his uncle after his parents died in a car accident when he was 12. He'd been working on cars since he was old enough to hold a wrench, and while he'd never gone to college, he could diagnose engine problems that stumped mechanics with decades of experience. There was something refreshing about his honesty, his complete lack of pretense. "What about you?" he asked. "Besides driving fancy cars that break down at inconvenient times?" I found myself telling him about my marketing degree, my parents' expectations, and the pressure to maintain our family's reputation in the community. Jake listened without judgment, occasionally asking thoughtful questions that showed he was really paying attention. When I mentioned feeling like I was living someone else's life, he nodded like he understood completely. "Sounds exhausting," he said quietly. "Trying to be perfect all the time." That conversation changed something in me. For the first time in years, I felt like someone saw me as more than just Richard and Patricia Clark's daughter. Jake saw Madison, the person behind, the designer clothes and the perfectly planned future. We started meeting for coffee at the little diner next to his shop. Then coffee turned into lunch. Lunch turned into long drives through the Connecticut countryside. And before I knew it, I was spending every free moment I had with this guy who could make me laugh until my sides hurt, and who listened to my dreams. Like they actually mattered. Jake had this way of seeing beauty in ordinary things. He'd point out how the light hit the old stone walls along the back roads, or he'd stop to help an elderly neighbor carry groceries, or he'd spend his Sunday mornings volunteering at the community center teaching kids basic car maintenance. He never made a big deal about any of it. It was just who he was. The first time he kissed me was in his uncle's garage after hours, surrounded by the smell of motor oil and the soft glow of the overhead fluorescent lights. It should have been completely unromantic, but it was perfect because it was real. No pretense, no performance, just two people who'd found something genuine in each other. For 3 months, I managed to keep our relationship separate from my family life. I'd tell my parents I was studying late or meeting friends, then spend hours with Jake exploring small towns throughout Connecticut, eating at diners my parents would never set foot in, talking about everything and nothing. He introduced me to his world, the tight-knit community of mechanics and small business owners who looked out for each other, the satisfaction of fixing something with your own hands, the peace that came from honest work. But secrets have a way of coming out, especially in a town like Westfield where everyone knows everyone else's business. My mother's friend Mrs. Whitman spotted us holding hands outside the movie theater downtown, and within 24 hours, the news had traveled through the country club gossip network and landed squarely on my parents' doorstep. The confrontation happened on a Thursday evening in November. I walked into our house to find both my parents waiting in the living room, their faces set in identical expressions of disappointment and barely controlled anger. "Madison," my father said, his voice cold and measured. "We need to talk." My mother held up her phone, showing a grainy photo that Mrs. Whitman had apparently taken of Jake and me at the farmer's market the previous weekend. We were laughing at something, completely oblivious to being watched, and seeing that moment of pure happiness frozen in a surveillance photo made my stomach turn. "Is this the boy you've been sneaking around with?" my mother demanded. "Patricia, Whitman says he works at that garage downtown. The one with all the broken cars in the parking lot." I tried to explain, to tell them about Jake's kindness, his integrity, the way he made me feel like I could be myself. But they weren't interested in hearing about his character. All they saw was a mechanic who didn't fit their vision of an appropriate boyfriend for their daughter. "Madison, you're 21 years old and about to graduate with a marketing degree," my father said, pacing back and forth across our pristine living room. "You have opportunities most people can only dream of. Why would you throw that away? For some boy who changes oil for a living?" "He's not some boy," I said, my voice shaking with frustration. "His name is Jake, and he's one of the best people I've ever met. You don't even know him." "We know enough," my mother snapped. "We know he's not the kind of person who belongs in our family. What would people think, Madison? What would we tell our friends at the club?" That's when I realized this wasn't really about Jake at all. It was about their image, their standing in the community, their need to control every aspect of my life to maintain their perfect facade. The fact that Jake made me genuinely happy meant nothing compared to what the neighbors might whisper at the next charity auction. The ultimatum came the next morning over breakfast, delivered with the same casual tone my mother used to discuss the weather. "Madison, your father and I have decided that you need to end this relationship immediately. We're willing to overlook this momentary lapse in judgment, but only if you promise never to see this boy again." I set down my coffee cup and looked at both of them, really looked at them, and saw two people who cared more about appearances than their own daughter's happiness. "No," I said quietly. The word hung in the air like a challenge. My father's face flushed red, and my mother's perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide the shock in her eyes. "Excuse me?" my father said. I said no. I won't break up with Jake just Because you don't think he's good enough for your precious reputation. What followed was the worst argument of my life. Voices raised, accusations flying, threats made, and ultimatums issued. My parents made it clear that as long as I continued seeing Jake, I was no longer welcome in their home. They would cut off my college tuition, remove me from their insurance, and essentially disown me until I came to my senses. I called their bluff. I packed a suitcase with whatever I could fit and walked out of the house I'd grown up in, not knowing if I'd ever be welcome back. Jake found me sitting in my car outside Morrison's auto shop at 10 o'clock that night, crying. Too hard to drive safely. Without asking any questions, he helped me carry my suitcase up to the small apartment above the garage where he lived with his Uncle Tony. "You can stay as long as you need," he said simply, as if taking in his girlfriend, who'd just been disowned by her wealthy parents, was the most natural thing in the world. That night, lying on Jake's couch and staring at the ceiling, I wondered if I'd just made the biggest mistake of my life. I'd given up everything: my family, my financial security, my comfortable future, for a relationship that was only 4 months old. But when Jake quietly brought me a cup of tea and sat beside me without trying to fix everything with empty reassurances, I knew I'd made the right choice. The next few weeks were the hardest of my life, but they were also the most clarifying. Stripped of my parents' financial support and social connections, I discovered who I really was when everything else was taken away. And Jake never once made me feel like a burden or questioned whether our relationship was worth the sacrifice I'd made. Living above Morrison's auto shop meant waking up to the sound of hydraulic lifts and air compressors at 7 in the morning. The apartment was tiny, just a kitchen, living room, and bedroom that Jake insisted I take while he slept on the pull-out couch. Uncle Tony had converted the space years ago, and while it wasn't fancy, it had something my parents' mansion never did. It felt like home. My first week there, I learned more about real life than 4 years of college had taught me. Jake showed me how to budget groceries, how to stretch $20 into meals for 3 people, and how to find joy in simple things like sharing pizza while watching old movies on Tony's ancient television. I'd never realized how sheltered I'd been, how many basic life skills I'd never needed to learn when everything was simply provided. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. The hardest part wasn't the cramped living space or the constant noise from the shop below. It was the complete silence from my parents. I'd expected angry phone calls, demands that I come home, maybe even attempts at negotiation. Instead, I got nothing. Radio silence that spoke louder than any argument ever could. They'd written me off completely, as if 21 years of being their daughter could be erased the moment I chose love over their approval. My college friends were equally disappointed. When word spread that I'd been disowned and was living above a garage, most of them simply stopped responding to my texts. The few who did reach out offered shallow sympathy mixed with barely concealed judgment. Sarah Patterson, who I'd considered my closest friend, actually had the nerve to suggest I was going through a phase and would come to my senses soon. But while I was losing the relationships I'd thought mattered, I was discovering a completely different world. The mechanics who worked at Morrison's treated me like family from day one. Carlos, who specialized in transmissions, brought his wife's homemade tamales for everyone to share. Miguel, the youngest guy in the shop, was putting himself through community college and helped me understand what it meant to work for your dreams instead of having them handed to you. Jake's friends welcomed me with the kind of genuine warmth I'd never experienced in my parents' social circle. There was Danny Kowalski, who ran the local pizza place and always sent extra food when he knew times were tight. Lisa Chen worked at the library and introduced me to volunteer opportunities I'd never known existed. These were people who measured success by different standards, by how you treated others, by your willingness to help when someone was struggling, by the integrity you showed when nobody was watching. 3 weeks after moving in, I landed a job. At Henderson Marketing, a small firm downtown that specializes in local businesses. The pay was a fraction of what I'd expected to earn after graduation, but Janet Henderson, the owner, took a chance on me despite my unusual circumstances. She'd heard through the local business network that Richard Clark's daughter was making it on her own, and she respected what that took. Most kids from your background never learn to hustle, she told me during my interview. The fact that you're here, willing to start at the bottom, tells me something about your character. Working at Henderson Marketing opened my eyes to how small businesses really operated. Instead of the corporate accounts I'd studied in school, I was helping the corner bakery develop their social media presence, creating flyers for the local hardware store's seasonal sales, and learning that effective marketing wasn't about expensive campaigns. It was about understanding your community and speaking their language. Jake and I fell into a comfortable routine. He'd leave for work at 7, I'd catch the bus downtown to my office, and we'd meet for lunch whenever our schedules aligned. Evenings were spent either helping in the shop — I learned I had a knack for organizing parts inventory — or exploring. More of Connecticut than I'd ever seen growing up. Jake knew every back road, every hidden waterfall, every local diner worth visiting. On weekends, we'd drive to small towns throughout New England, visiting antique shops and farmers markets, hiking trails that tourists never found. Jake had this gift for finding beauty in places most people overlooked. He'd stop at roadside stands selling fresh corn, chat with elderly shop owners about their family histories, and always seemed to know exactly where to find the best view or the most interesting story. It was during one of these weekend adventures in early December that I first learned there might be more to Jake's background than I'd assumed. We were in Vermont, visiting a small town's Christmas market, when we stopped at a booth selling handmade wooden furniture. The craftsman, an older gentleman named Robert, immediately recognized Jake. "Morrison," he called out, breaking into a huge grin. "Haven't seen you since the funeral. How are you holding up, son?" Jake's entire demeanor changed. The easy smile disappeared, replaced by something guarded and uncomfortable. "Hey, Robert. I'm doing okay. Just showing Madison around." Robert's eyes softened when he looked at me, then back at Jake. "Your father would be proud of how you've handled everything. Taking care of Tony, keeping the business running. Not many young men would have made the choices you did." After we walked away, I tried to ask Jake about the conversation, but he deflected with jokes and questions about what we should have for dinner. I didn't push. Everyone had parts of their past they weren't ready to discuss, but I filed the interaction away as another small mystery about the man I was falling deeper in love with every day. Christmas approached, and with it came the realization that this would be my first holiday completely separated from my family. I tried not to think about the elaborate parties my parents always threw, the expensive gifts, the traditions we'd maintained for years. Instead, Jake, Tony, and I created our own celebration. We decorated a small tree from the lot down the street, cooked a simple dinner together, and exchanged modest gifts that meant more than any expensive present I'd ever received. Jake gave me a small silver necklace with a pendant shaped like a compass rose. "So you'll always know which direction you're heading," he said, fastening it around my neck. The inscription on the back read, "True North," a reminder that sometimes the right path isn't the easy one. I gave him a leather-bound journal, hoping he might share more of his thoughts and dreams with me through writing, even if he wasn't ready to voice them yet. Tony presented us both with matching coffee mugs that read, "Morrison's Family," officially making me part of their unconventional household. That night, as Jake and I sat on the small balcony outside the apartment, watching snow fall over the quiet streets of Westfield, I realized I'd never been happier. I had less money than I'd ever had in my life, lived in a space smaller than my childhood bedroom, and worked longer hours for less pay than I'd thought possible. But I also had something I'd never experienced before: a relationship built on genuine partnership, respect, and shared values. "Any regrets?" Jake asked, as if reading my thoughts. I considered the question seriously, I missed certain aspects of my old life: the financial security, the ease of having problems solved with money, even some of the family traditions. But when I weighed those things against what I'd gained, the choice seemed obvious. None, I said, and meant it completely. Jake was quiet for a long moment, then said something that would stick with me for months afterward. Sometimes the most important decisions we make are the ones that cost us everything we thought we wanted. Winter deepened, and life settled into a rhythm that felt sustainable and genuine. I was earning enough to contribute meaningfully to household expenses. My work at Henderson Marketing was challenging and rewarding, and my relationship with Jake continued to grow stronger. We talked about the future sometimes, maybe finding our own apartment, potentially getting married someday, building a life together that honored both our dreams and our values. But there were still moments when Jake seemed distant, times when he'd receive phone calls that made him step outside, conversations that ended abruptly when I entered the room. I'd catch him staring out the window with an expression I couldn't quite read, as if he was wrestling with something he couldn't share. Tony noticed it too. One evening in late January, while Jake was working late on a particularly difficult repair, Tony and I were cleaning up the dinner dishes when he brought it up. "He's carrying something heavy," Tony said quietly. "Has been since his father died. Some burdens are too big for one person to handle alone. But Jake's always been stubborn about asking for help." "Is there anything I should know?" I asked. "Anything that might help me understand what he's going through?" Tony dried a plate slowly, considering his words carefully. Jake's father was a complicated man. Left behind some unfinished business that's been weighing on the boy for 2 years now. I keep telling him it's time to deal with it, but he's scared of what it might change. "Change how?" "Change everything," Tony said simply. "And after losing, so much change feels dangerous, even when it might be good." That conversation planted a seed of curiosity that grew stronger over the following weeks. I began noticing details I'd overlooked before: the way Jake sometimes received mail addressed to different names, phone calls from lawyers and accountants that he took in private, documents he'd quickly put away when I entered the room. None of it seemed suspicious exactly, but it painted a picture of someone dealing with complicated circumstances he wasn't ready to discuss. The revelation came on a cold February morning, in the most unexpected way possible. The revelation came on Valentine's Day, of all days. I'd woken up early to surprise Jake with breakfast before he headed down to the shop, but found him sitting at the small kitchen table with his head in his hands, surrounded by official-looking documents and manila folders I'd never seen before. "Jake?" I said softly, not wanting to startle him. "Everything okay?" He looked up, and I could see he'd been awake for hours. His eyes were red-rimmed, and there was a heaviness in his expression that I'd never witnessed before. The documents spread across the table bore letterheads from law firms I didn't recognize, along with what appeared to be financial statements and property deeds. "I need to tell you something," he said quietly. "I should have told you months ago, but I was scared of how it might change things between us." My heart started racing. In the silence that followed, my mind jumped to the worst possibilities. Was he married? Did he have children somewhere? Was he in some kind of legal trouble? Jake gathered the papers into a neat stack, then looked directly at me. "My father didn't just die in an accident 2 years ago. He was murdered." The words hit me like a physical blow. I sat down heavily in the chair across from him, trying to process what he'd just said. "Murdered?" I whispered. "His name was Vincent Morrison, and he owned Morrison Industries, a manufacturing company based in Hartford. You probably never heard of it because they specialized in industrial equipment, but it was worth about $50 million when he died." I stared at Jake, trying to reconcile this information with everything I thought I knew about him. "But you work in Tony's garage. You live in this tiny apartment. You drive a 10-year-old pickup truck." "Because I chose to," Jake said. "When my father was killed, I inherited everything. The company, the estate, all of it. But I also inherited his enemies, his debts, and a business I never wanted to be part of. He stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the quiet street below. My father wasn't a good man, Madison. Morrison Industries was successful, but he cut corners, exploited workers, and made deals with people who didn't hesitate to use violence when things didn't go their way. His murder was a message to other business owners who were thinking about crossing the wrong people. The story that unfolded over the next hour was like something from a movie, except it was real, and it was happening to the man I loved. Vincent Morrison had built his fortune through a combination of legitimate business and questionable partnerships. When he tried to break away from his more dangerous associates, they'd made sure he couldn't expose their operations. The police never found who killed him, Jake continued. But I knew. And I knew that if I stepped into his role, I'd either have to play by their rules or end up like him. So you walked away from $50 million? I walked away from a life that would have destroyed me, Jake corrected. I put the company in trust, let the lawyers handle the transition, and came here to live with Tony. I thought if I kept my head down, worked honest jobs, and stayed out of Hartford, I could just disappear into a normal life. I was struggling to understand the magnitude of what he was telling me. But Jake, $50 million could solve a lot of problems. You could help people, create jobs, make a real difference. With blood money? He asked, turning back to face me. Madison, you don't understand what that world is like. The meetings, in back rooms, the threats disguised as business negotiations, the constant fear that you're being watched. I've seen what money like that does to people. But what if there was another way? What if you could take control of the company and run it differently? Jake laughed bitterly. You think I haven't considered that? I've spent 2 years trying to figure out how to handle this situation. Every few months, the lawyers call with updates, reminding me that I can't ignore this forever. The company is still generating revenue, the trust fund is still growing, and eventually, I'm going to have to make a decision about what to do with it all. That's when I noticed the specific document he'd been staring at when I found him. It was a letter from Brennan, Walsh and Associates, dated 3 days earlier. The subject line read, Urgent, Morrison Industries acquisition offer. Response required by February 20th. Someone wants to buy the company? I asked. Jake nodded grimly. A consortium of investors has made an offer for the entire operation. They want to acquire Morrison Industries, assume all assets and liabilities, and release me from any further involvement. The offer is for $68 million. The number was staggering. I tried to wrap my mind around what that kind of money could mean, not just for Jake, but for everyone whose lives could be changed by it. When do you have to decide? 6 days, Jake said. If I don't respond by February 20th, the offer expires, and I'm back to dealing with this mess indefinitely. Over the next several days, Jake and I talked about the situation from every possible angle. I learned that Vincent Morrison's business practices had hurt a lot of people, workers who'd been laid off without notice, small suppliers who'd never been paid, communities that had been promised jobs that never materialized. The company's reputation was so damaged that no legitimate business leader wanted to be associated with it. But I also learned that Jake had been quietly using some of the trust fund money to help people his father had wronged. Anonymous payments to former employees, contributions to community organizations in towns where Morrison Industries had closed factories, scholarships for kids whose parents had lost their jobs. He'd been trying to make amends without taking credit or drawing attention to himself. You've been doing this for 2 years? I asked, looking through a folder of receipts and bank statements. It's not enough, Jake said. It'll never be enough to undo the damage he caused. But it's something. I began to understand why Jake had been so secretive, why he'd seemed burdened by something he couldn't share. He'd been carrying the weight of his father's legacy while trying to build a life based on completely different values. The contrast between his inherited wealth and his chosen lifestyle wasn't about rejecting money. It was about rejecting the corruption that had generated it. The irony wasn't lost on me. While my parents had disowned me for dating someone they considered financially unsuitable, I'd fallen in love with a man who was technically worth more than my family's entire estate. But Jake's wealth came with complications that made my parents' money look simple by comparison. "What happens if you take the buyout offer?" I asked. "I walk away with enough money to do whatever I want, but I also walk away from any chance of fixing what my father broke. The buyers won't care about making amends to the people who were hurt. They'll strip the company for parts, sell off the valuable assets, and leave the mess for someone else to clean up. And if you don't take it?" "I take control of Morrison Industries and try to rebuild it into something I can be proud of. But that means moving to Hartford, dealing with lawyers and accountants and board members every day, and potentially putting myself at risk from the same people who killed my father." There was a third option that Jake hadn't articulated, but that hung in the air between us. He could continue to do nothing, letting the company exist in legal limbo while he lived his quiet life above the garage. But that limbo was clearly eating away at him, and the recent acquisition offer had forced him to confront the reality that he couldn't avoid this decision forever. That weekend, we drove to Hartford so I could see Morrison Industries for myself. The headquarters was a modern glass building in the downtown business district, surrounded by other corporate offices and professional firms. Walking through the empty halls on a Saturday afternoon, I could see the remnants of what had once been a thriving operation. Conference rooms with expensive furniture, executive offices with panoramic views of the city, a lobby designed to impress visitors and intimidate competitors. But I could also see the signs of neglect and uncertainty. Offices that had been cleared out and never refilled, outdated equipment that hadn't been replaced, a general atmosphere of abandonment that suggested a company running on autopilot rather than leadership. "This place used to employ 300 people, Jake said as we walked through the main production floor. "Now it's down to about 60, mostly maintenance and administrative staff keeping the lights on." I tried to imagine what it would be like for Jake to walk into this building every day, to sit in his father's office and make decisions that affected dozens of families. The responsibility would be enormous, but so would the opportunity to create something positive from the wreckage Vincent Morrison had left behind. On the drive back to Westfield, I finally asked the question that had been on my mind since Jake first told me about his inheritance. "What do you want to do? Not what you think you should do, or what would be easiest, or what would make other people happy. What do you actually want?" Jake was quiet for several miles, staring at the road ahead as if the answer might be painted on the asphalt. "I want to prove that it's possible to build something good from something terrible," he said finally. "I want to show that not all Morrison men have to be like my father, but I'm terrified that trying to change things will either get me killed or turn me into the kind of person I despise. And you're terrified that if you don't try, you'll spend the rest of your life wondering what could have been different." Exactly. That night, as we lay in bed in the small apartment above the garage, I realized that Jake's decision would affect not just his future, but ours. If he took the buyout, we could build a life together anywhere we wanted, with enough money to never worry about practical concerns again. If he took control of Morrison Industries, our relationship would have to survive the pressures of corporate leadership, public scrutiny, and possibly physical danger. But there was something else I'd begun to understand about Jake Morrison. The qualities that had made me fall in love with him, his integrity, his compassion, his willingness to sacrifice for others, were the same qualities that made him capable of transforming his father's legacy. The question wasn't whether he had the ability to rebuild Morrison Industries into something ethical and successful. The question was whether he had the courage to try. The deadline was 4 days away, and I could see the weight of the decision pressing down on him like a physical burden. Whatever he chose, there would be no going back to the simple life we'd been building together above the garage. Change was coming whether we wanted it or not. The decision came down to a single phone call on February 19th, just hours before the acquisition deadline expired. Jake had been pacing the apartment all morning, the legal documents spread across every available surface like pieces of a puzzle he couldn't solve. I'd taken the day off work, knowing he needed support, but unsure how to provide it without influencing, a choice that would define the rest of his life. At 2:47 p.m., his phone rang. The caller ID showed Brennan, Walsh and Associates. "Mr. Morrison," came the voice of Thomas Brennan, the lead attorney handling the acquisition. "I trust you've reached a decision regarding the consortium's offer. I need to remind you that we have until 5 p.m. today to submit your response, or the deal expires permanently." Jake looked at me across the room, and I could see 24 months of anguish crystallizing into a single moment of clarity. "Mr. Brennan?" Jake said, his voice steady for the first time in days. "I'm declining the acquisition offer. I want to assume full control of Morrison Industries, effective immediately." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for nearly 10 seconds. When Brennan spoke again, his tone had shifted from routine professionalism to genuine concern. "Mr. Morrison, I feel obligated to remind you of the significant risks involved in this decision. The company's current financial position, the outstanding legal issues, the personal safety concerns we've discussed. Are you absolutely certain this is the path you want to pursue?" "I'm certain," Jake replied. "Schedule a board meeting for next Monday. I want to address the staff personally and begin implementing immediate changes to company operations." After he hung up, Jake sat down heavily on the couch, as if the weight of his decision was finally hitting him. "You realize what this means?" I asked gently. "It means I stop running from who I am," he said. "It means I stop letting fear of my father's mistakes prevent me from making my own choices. And it means our lives are about to get a lot more complicated." The transformation began immediately. Over the weekend, Jake met with accountants, lawyers, and business consultants to understand exactly what he was inheriting. The picture that emerged was both worse and better than he'd imagined. Morrison Industries was hemorrhaging money through inefficient operations and legal settlements, but it also had valuable patents, skilled employees, and contracts that could be profitable if managed ethically. Monday morning, I watched Jake put on a suit for the first time since I'd known him. The transformation was startling. Gone was the mechanic in oil-stained coveralls, replaced by a young executive who looked like he belonged in corporate boardrooms. But when he kissed me goodbye, I could still see the uncertainty in his eyes. "What if I'm making a huge mistake?" he asked. "Then you'll learn from it and make better choices going forward," I said. "But Jake, doing nothing was also a choice, and it was slowly killing you." The board meeting was scheduled for 10 a.m. at Morrison Industries headquarters. Jake had asked me to come with him, not as a girlfriend, but as someone with marketing experience who might help him communicate his vision to the employees. Walking into that glass building as Jake Morrison's partner, rather than a visitor, felt surreal. The boardroom contained 8 people, executives and department heads who'd been keeping the company afloat during 2 years of absentee ownership. Their faces showed a mixture of curiosity, skepticism, and hope as Jake took his seat at the head of the conference table. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jake began, "I want to start by acknowledging that my absence over the past 2 years has created uncertainty and instability for everyone in this room. I also want to acknowledge that my father's leadership caused significant harm to employees, suppliers, and communities that trusted this company." The room was absolutely silent. Several board members exchanged glances, clearly unsure where this was heading. "I'm here today to announce that I'm assuming full operational control of Morrison Industries and that we're going to rebuild this company from the ground up. Not just financially, but ethically. We're going to prove that it's possible to be profitable while treating people with dignity and respect." Margaret Chen, the head of human resources, spoke first. "Mr. Morrison, with all due respect, what qualifications do you have to run a manufacturing company? Your background is in automotive repair, not corporate management." It was a fair question. and Jake had prepared for it. "You're absolutely right that I lack traditional corporate experience. That's why I'm not going to pretend I can do this alone. I want each of you to help me understand how this company really works, what problems need immediate attention, and what opportunities we're missing." Over the next 2 hours, Jake listened as each department head outlined their challenges. The picture that emerged was of a company with good bones but poor leadership. Talented employees who'd been demoralized by years of cost-cutting and ethical compromises, valuable products that weren't being marketed effectively, and operational inefficiencies that were costing millions annually. But there were also opportunities. Morrison Industries held patents on several innovative manufacturing processes that competitors were eager to license. The company's reputation for quality products, despite its management problems, meant that many clients were willing to give it another chance under new leadership. Jake's first decision surprised everyone. Instead of cutting costs or downsizing, he announced that Morrison Industries would immediately begin a comprehensive review of all employee compensation, with the goal of bringing wages up to industry standards within 6 months. "How can we afford that when we're barely profitable?" asked David Rodriguez, the chief financial officer. "Because investing in our people is the only way to build a sustainable business," Jake replied. "I'd rather have a smaller, highly motivated workforce than a large group of employees who don't trust their leadership." The meeting ended with Jake asking each department head to prepare detailed reports on their operations, including recommendations for improvements and investments they'd been unable to make due to budget constraints. He also announced that he'd be spending the next month visiting every facility, meeting with employees at all levels, and learning the business from the ground up. That afternoon, word of Jake's decision spread through the company like wildfire. Some employees were skeptical. They'd been disappointed by promises before. Others were cautiously optimistic, hoping that Vincent Morrison's son might be different from his father. A few were openly excited about the possibility of real change. The news also reached the broader Hartford business community within hours. Local newspapers picked up the story of the young heir who'd finally claimed his inheritance, and speculation began immediately about what changes he might implement. Some coverage was positive, focusing on Jake's commitment to ethical business practices. Other articles questioned whether someone with his limited experience could successfully turn around a struggling company. More concerning were the anonymous phone calls that began within days of Jake's announcement. Voices I didn't recognize would call the apartment at odd hours, sometimes hanging up without speaking, sometimes delivering vague warnings about not stirring up old business or being careful about making enemies. Jake tried to downplay these calls, but I could see they were affecting him. 2 weeks into his new role, Jake made his first major personal decision. He fired Marcus Webb, the vice president of operations who'd been his father's closest associate, and who had been involved in many of the company's questionable practices. Webb didn't go quietly. He threatened lawsuits, made accusations about Jake's qualifications, and implied that there were secrets about Morrison Industries that Jake didn't understand. "Let him talk," Jake told me that evening. "Anyone who was part of my father's inner circle needs to go. I can't build an ethical company with people who profit from corruption." But Webb's firing had consequences. 3 other executives resigned in solidarity, taking valuable institutional knowledge with them. Several contracts were suddenly put under review by clients who'd had personal relationships with the departed executives. Most seriously, Jake discovered that Webb had been managing several off-the-books arrangements that generated significant revenue, but violated multiple regulations. He was essentially running a shadow company within the company, Jake explained, showing me financial records that made my head spin. Payments to shell corporations, contracts with no paper trail, relationships with suppliers who don't legally exist. Shutting this down is going to cost us millions in lost revenue. But keeping it would have cost you your integrity, I pointed out. Tell that to the 60 families who depend on Morrison Industries for their livelihood, Jake said grimly. The pressure was taking its toll on both of us. Jake was working 14-hour days, trying to master a business he'd never wanted to inherit, while making decisions that affected dozens of lives. Our quiet evenings together were replaced by late-night strategy sessions and early-morning crisis management calls. The simple life we'd built above the garage felt like a distant memory. I was struggling too. My job at Henderson Marketing seemed insignificant compared to the corporate drama unfolding at Morrison Industries, but Jake needed me to maintain some connection to the normal world we'd shared. I became his sounding board, his refuge from the constant pressure of corporate leadership, and occasionally his conscience when the temptation to compromise his values became overwhelming. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening in March. Jake arrived home exhausted and defeated, carrying a folder of documents that represented the latest crisis. "The Environmental Protection Agency is launching a formal investigation," he said, collapsing onto the couch. "Apparently, my father's company has been dumping industrial waste illegally for years. The cleanup could cost $15 million, and if we're found criminally liable, I could face personal prosecution." I sat beside him, trying to process what this meant. "Can you prove you weren't involved in the illegal dumping?" "It doesn't matter. As the owner, I'm responsible for everything the company has ever done. Every corner my father cut, every law he broke, every person he hurt. It's all on me now." For the first time since he'd made the decision to take control of Morrison Industries, Jake looked like he regretted his choice. The weight of his father's legacy was crushing him, and I began to wonder if we'd underestimated the cost of trying to build something good from something fundamentally corrupt. But then Jake did something that reminded me why I'd fallen in love with him in the first place. Instead of looking for ways to minimize his legal exposure or shift blame to his deceased father, he started planning how Morrison Industries could take full responsibility for the environmental damage and fund a cleanup that went beyond what the EPA required. "If we're going to do this," he said, his voice gaining strength, "we're going to do it right, even if it bankrupts us." That night, as I watched Jake work on a plan to turn his company's biggest liability into an opportunity to demonstrate genuine corporate responsibility, I realized that the man I'd met at a broken-down garage was still there underneath the expensive suits and corporate pressure. The stakes were higher now, the consequences more severe, but Jake's fundamental character hadn't changed. What had changed was everything else. The morning of April 15th brought news that changed everything. I was getting ready for work when Jake burst through the apartment door, his face flushed with an excitement I hadn't seen in weeks. "Madison, you're not going to believe this," he said, waving a thick legal document. "Remember that EPA investigation? The one that was supposed to destroy us?" I set down my coffee, bracing myself for more bad news. The past month had been a relentless series of crises, each one threatening to undo everything Jake was trying to build. "They found something," Jake continued, his voice gaining momentum. "The illegal dumping wasn't just Morrison Industries. It was part of a consortium of 6 companies, all working together to avoid environmental regulations. My father was keeping detailed records of everything: names, dates, amounts, locations. He was building a case. The implication hit me immediately. He was going to expose them? "That's why they killed him," Jake said, sinking into a chair as the full weight of this revelation settled over him. Vincent Morrison wasn't just another corrupt businessman. He was trying to get out, trying to make things right, and they murdered him to keep him quiet. The documents Jake spread across our kitchen table told a story that reframed everything we thought we knew about his father's death. Vincent Morrison had been secretly cooperating with federal investigators for 8 months before his murder, providing evidence of widespread environmental crimes, illegal dumping operations, and conspiracy to defraud government agencies. "Look at this," Jake said, pointing to a handwritten note dated just 3 days before Vincent's death. He was planning to testify before a grand jury. He'd already transferred $15 million into an escrow account specifically designated for environmental cleanup and victim compensation. The FBI had been looking for these documents for 2 years. Vincent Morrison's cooperation had been so secret that even the federal prosecutors didn't know where he'd hidden the evidence. Now, with Jake's decision to voluntarily turn over his father's files, the entire criminal conspiracy was about to unravel. Special Agent Sarah Coleman arrived at Morrison Industries that afternoon with a team of forensic accountants and environmental specialists. She was a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who'd been investigating corporate environmental crimes for over a decade. "Mr. Morrison?" she said, shaking Jake's hand in the conference room. "What you're doing here takes considerable courage. Your father's evidence is going to help us prosecute some very dangerous people." "What does this mean for Morrison Industries?" Jake asked. "It means you're no longer a target of our investigation," Coleman replied. "In fact, your company is now considered a victim and a key witness. The environmental cleanup costs will be shared among all 6 companies involved in the conspiracy, and there are federal funds available to help with remediation efforts." But the agent's next words carried a warning that made my blood run cold. "However, Mr. Morrison, I need to be very clear about the risks you're facing. The people who killed your father are still out there, and they're not going to be happy about these documents surfacing. We strongly recommend you accept federal protection until we can make arrests." Jake refused the protection, insisting he wouldn't live in fear or hide from his responsibilities to his employees. But he did agree to enhanced security at Morrison Industries and accepted Agent Coleman's recommendation that we move out of the apartment above the garage. Within a week, we were living in a secure downtown Hartford apartment, complete with building security and surveillance systems. The change from our cozy space above Tony's garage to this sterile corporate housing felt like moving to another planet. I missed the sound of hydraulic lifts and the smell of motor oil, the easy camaraderie of the mechanics downstairs, the sense of being part of a real community. But the investigation was moving quickly. Using Vincent Morrison's evidence, the FBI arrested Marcus Webb, Jake's former vice president, along with executives from 4 other companies. The conspiracy they'd uncovered involved over $200 million in environmental fraud, affecting communities across 3 states. The arrests made national news, and suddenly Jake found himself in the spotlight as the whistleblower who'd brought down a major corporate crime ring. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. The same inheritance he'd tried to escape had ultimately provided the key to exposing his father's killers. Vincent Morrison died trying to do the right thing, Jake told a reporter from the Hartford Courant. "The least I can do is finish what he started." The positive media attention brought unexpected opportunities. Morrison Industries began receiving calls from potential clients who wanted to work with a company that had demonstrated genuine ethical leadership. The state of Connecticut offered tax incentives for Jake's environmental cleanup efforts. 3 major suppliers reached out about exclusive partnerships, impressed by Morrison's commitment to transparency and corporate responsibility. Most significantly, the federal escrow account Vincent had established, the $15 million he'd set aside for environmental remediation, was released to Morrison Industries with instructions that it be used exactly as Vincent had intended. For the first time since taking control of the company, Jake had the resources to implement his vision without compromising the company's financial stability. But success brought new challenges. The board of directors, initially skeptical of Jake's leadership, was now eager to capitalize on the company's newfound reputation. They pushed for rapid expansion, suggesting Morrison Industries could become a model for ethical manufacturing that other companies would pay to emulate. "We could license our processes, consult on environmental compliance, maybe even acquire some of the smaller companies that are struggling with similar issues," suggested David Rodriguez during a board meeting I attended as Jake's advisor. Jake was torn. The opportunities were genuine, and Morrison Industries had the expertise and credibility to help other companies avoid the mistakes his father had made. But rapid growth also meant hiring quickly, making decisions under pressure, and potentially losing the careful, deliberate approach that had guided his transformation of the company. "I don't want to build an empire," Jake told me one evening as we reviewed expansion proposals. "I want to build something sustainable, something I can be proud of in 20 years. The pressure wasn't just professional. Our relationship was evolving, too, shaped by circumstances neither of us had anticipated when I'd first moved into that tiny apartment above the garage. Jake was no longer just the kind mechanic who'd fixed my car. He was a public figure, a corporate executive, someone whose decisions affected hundreds of lives and made headlines in business magazines. I was struggling to find my role in this new reality. My job at Henderson Marketing felt increasingly irrelevant compared to the high-stakes corporate drama surrounding Morrison Industries. Jake had offered me a position at his company, heading up their new public relations and community outreach department. But I was hesitant to blur the lines between our personal and professional lives even further. The decision was made for me in late May, when Henderson Marketing lost 3 major clients in a single week. Janet Henderson called me into her office with an expression I'd never seen before, a mixture of disappointment and resignation. "Madison, I'm going to have to let you go," she said bluntly. "Business has been slow, and with Jake Morrison's girlfriend on staff, some of our clients are worried about conflicts of interest." The irony was bitter. I'd been fired from my job because people assumed my relationship with Jake gave me unfair advantages, while in reality, his success had made my professional life more complicated, not easier. That evening I told Jake what had happened. His reaction was immediate and predictable: anger at the unfairness, guilt that his circumstances had cost me my job, and an immediate offer to hire me at Morrison Industries with a salary that would more than compensate for what I'd lost. "Don't want to be your employee," I said firmly. "And I don't want people to think I'm with you because of your money." "Then what do you want?" Jake asked, and I could hear the frustration in his voice. "Madison, we're partners in this. Everything I'm trying to build, I want to build with you. But you keep pushing me away every time I try to include you." It was the first real fight we'd had since he'd taken control of Morrison Industries, and it forced us to confront questions we'd been avoiding. What did it mean to be partners when one person controlled a $50 million company? How could we maintain the equality that had defined our relationship when our circumstances were so dramatically different? Was it possible to build a life together when the foundation of that life kept shifting beneath our feet? The argument ended with both of us saying things we regretted, and I spent the night in the apartment's guest bedroom, staring at the ceiling and wondering if we were strong enough to survive the success that was supposed to make everything better. The next morning brought a call that would test that strength in ways I never could have imagined. Agent Coleman's voice was tense and urgent. "Mr. Morrison, we've received credible intelligence that there's going to be an attempt on your life within the next 48 hours. We need to move you to a safe location immediately." The game had changed again, and this time, the stakes were life and death. The safe house was a nondescript ranch home in Middletown, Connecticut, surrounded by federal agents who looked like they belonged in action movies rather than suburban neighborhoods. Jake and I had rushed there within hours of Agent Coleman's warning, carrying nothing but the clothes on our backs and a growing sense that our lives had spiraled completely beyond our control. "How long do we have to stay here?" I asked Agent Coleman as she conducted a security briefing in the living room that had been hastily converted into a command center. "Until we neutralize the threat," she replied. "Our intelligence suggests that Raymond Castellano, the head of the environmental crime syndicate, has contracted a professional hit team. They've been surveilling Morrison Industries for weeks, looking for patterns in Jake's schedule." Jake was pacing by the window, his jaw clenched with barely controlled anger. "So instead of going after the people who actually committed crimes, they're coming after the guy who helped you catch them?" "Mr. Morrison, you have to understand the magnitude of what your father's evidence exposed," Coleman explained. "Castellano's organization wasn't just dumping waste illegally. They were running a sophisticated operation that involved bribing government officials, falsifying environmental reports, and intimidating witnesses. Your testimony could put him away for life. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on me. 6 months ago, Jake had been living quietly above his uncle's garage, trying to avoid any connection to his father's legacy. Now he was in federal protection, because that same legacy had made him the key witness in one of the largest environmental crime prosecutions in Connecticut history. Our first night in the safe house was surreal. Federal agents monitored our phones, screened our communications, and accompanied us everywhere, even to the bathroom. The freedom we'd taken for granted was gone, replaced by a suffocating sense of being watched and protected simultaneously. "This isn't sustainable," Jake said as we lay in the narrow twin beds that had been set up in what was once someone's spare bedroom. "I can't run Morrison Industries from hiding, and I can't ask my employees to work for a CEO who's afraid to show his face." "You're not afraid," I said. "You're being smart. There's a difference." But I could see the situation was eating away at him. Jake had built his entire identity around taking responsibility, facing problems head-on, and being present for the people who depended on him. Hiding in a government safe house while other people managed his company violated everything he believed about leadership. The third day brought unexpected visitors. Toni Morrison arrived with Danny Kowalski and 2 other mechanics from the garage, all of them looking uncomfortable in the sterile government facility, but determined to show their support. "Kid, you look terrible," Toni said, pulling Jake into a bear hug that lasted longer than usual. "When's the last time you got a decent night's sleep?" "About 3 months ago," Jake replied, and I could hear the exhaustion in his voice. Danny had brought news from the real world, the world we'd been cut off from since entering protection. Morrison Industries was functioning under the leadership of Margaret Chen, the HR director Jake had promoted to interim CEO. Employee morale was surprisingly high, driven partly by pride in their company's role in exposing corporate corruption and partly by the substantial pay raises Jake had implemented. Before going into hiding, "People are worried about you," Danny said, "but they're not panicking. You built something solid there, Jake. It's not going to fall apart just because you're not in the office for a few days." But a few days stretched into 2 weeks. Then 3. The federal investigation was progressing, but slowly. Castellanos' organization had gone underground, making arrests difficult and the threat to Jake's safety ongoing. Agent Coleman provided daily briefings that were heavy on technical details but light on hope for a quick resolution. The isolation was taking its toll on both of us. Jake grew increasingly restless and irritable, frustrated by his inability to directly manage the crisis at Morrison Industries. I found myself caught between supporting his need to return to normal life and recognizing the very real danger we faced. Our relationship, already strained by the pressures of corporate success, began to crack under the additional stress of confinement and uncertainty. Small disagreements escalated into major arguments. Jake blamed himself for dragging me into a dangerous situation I'd never asked for. I resented being treated like a victim, rather than a partner in whatever decisions lay ahead. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in June when Jake announced he was leaving the safe house. "I've made my decision," he told Agent Coleman during the daily briefing. "I'm going back to Hartford. I'll testify whenever you need me to, but I won't spend another day hiding from people who should be afraid of me." "Mr. Morrison, I cannot stress strongly enough how dangerous that decision is," Coleman replied. "We have confirmed intelligence that Castellanos' people are actively hunting for you. Leaving protection could be signing your death warrant." "Then arrest Castellano," Jake shot back. "You've had 3 weeks to find him. How much more time do you need?" The agent's expression revealed the truth she'd been reluctant to share. They had no idea where Castellano was, and no timeline for when they might apprehend him. The safe house wasn't temporary protection, it was indefinite exile. That afternoon, Jake and I had the most serious conversation of our relationship. Sitting in the backyard of the safe house, surrounded by federal agents trying to look inconspicuous, we faced the reality that our lives might never return to normal. "Madison, I need you to know that you don't have to stay with me through this," Jake said quietly. "You didn't sign up for death threats and federal protection. You could walk away. Right now, go back to a normal life, and I wouldn't blame you for a second." The offer hurt more than I'd expected. After everything we'd been through together, from my parents' rejection to his corporate transformation to this current crisis, the suggestion that I might abandon him felt like a fundamental misunderstanding of who I was and what our relationship meant. "Is that what you want?" I asked. "For me to leave?" "I want you to be safe and happy," Jake replied. "If staying with me means you can't be either of those things, then yes, I want you to leave." I looked at this man who'd become the center of my world, sitting in a government safe house because he'd chosen to do the right thing rather than the easy thing, willing to sacrifice our relationship to protect me from the consequences of his moral choices. The contrast with my parents, who'd kicked me out for embarrassing them at the country club, couldn't have been starker. "Jake Morrison," I said, taking his hand, "I didn't fall in love with you because life was easy. I fell in love with you because you're the kind of person who fixes what's broken, even when it's dangerous. Especially when it's dangerous." That evening, Jake made 2 phone calls that would determine our fate. The first was to Agent Coleman, informing her that he was leaving. Federal protection in 48 hours regardless of the security situation. The second was to Margaret Chen at Morrison Industries, asking her to arrange a press conference where he would publicly address the ongoing investigation and the threats against his life. "If Castellano wants to find me," Jake told me, "I'm going to make it easy for him. But I'm going to do it on my terms, in a way that exposes him and protects everyone else." Agent Coleman was furious when she learned about Jake's plan. "Mr. Morrison, this is exactly the kind of public appearance that will make you a target. You're essentially painting a bullseye on your chest." "Good," Jake replied. "Maybe then people can finally do their jobs and arrest the people shooting at it." The press conference was scheduled for Friday afternoon at Morrison Industries headquarters. Jake would announce the company's new environmental initiatives, discuss the ongoing federal investigation, and make a public statement about corporate responsibility that would serve as both a challenge to his enemies and a declaration of his principles. But as we prepared to leave the safe house and return to the real world, none of us knew that Castellanos' people had been planning their own public statement. Intelligence reports that wouldn't reach Agent Coleman until hours later revealed that the hit team had been waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity, a public appearance where they could eliminate their target and send a message to anyone else who might consider cooperating with federal investigators. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test everything Jake had built, everything we'd fought for, and everything we meant to each other. On Friday morning, as federal agents conducted their final security sweep of Morrison Industries, Jake put on his best suit and looked at himself in the mirror of our Hartford apartment. "Whatever happens today," he said, "I want you to know that meeting you was the best thing that ever happened to me. Everything good I've done, everything I've built. It started the day my car broke down and you needed help." I kissed him, tasting the fear and determination in equal measure. "Then let's go finish what?" We started. The press conference was scheduled for 2 p.m. At 1:47 p.m., as Jake was reviewing his notes one final time, Agent Coleman burst into the conference room with news that changed everything. "We've got him," she said, breathless from running. "Raymond, Castellano was arrested 20 minutes ago at a warehouse in New Haven. The hit team surrendered without resistance." The relief was overwhelming, but it was tempered by a new realization. The crisis that had defined our lives for months was finally over, but the life we'd built during that crisis, the choices we'd made, the people we'd become, would last forever. Jake still gave his press conference that afternoon, but instead of a defiant challenge to his enemies, it became a victory speech about justice, corporate responsibility, and the power of ordinary people to create extraordinary change. 6 months after Raymond Castellanos' arrest, Jake and I stood on the observation deck of Morrison Industries' newest facility, a state-of-the-art environmental technology center in New Haven, built on the exact site where Castellanos' illegal dumping operation had once poisoned the soil. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. Where criminals had once destroyed the environment, Jake was now creating technology to heal it. "You know what the strangest part is?" Jake said, watching workers install solar panels on the facility's roof. "I spent 2 years trying to escape my father's legacy, and now I realize I was never running from him. I was running toward who I was supposed to become." The transformation of Morrison Industries had exceeded everyone's expectations, including our own. What had started as Jake's attempt to salvage an ethical business from his father's corrupt empire had evolved into something much larger, a model for how corporate America could operate when profit and principle worked together instead of against each other. The numbers told part of the story. In the 8 months since Jake had taken control, Morrison Industries had tripled its workforce, increased revenue by 400%, and earned recognition as Connecticut's most innovative manufacturing company. But the real measure of success wasn't financial. It was the fundamental change in how business could be conducted when guided by genuine values rather than quarterly earnings reports. The Environmental Technology Center was Jake's proudest achievement. Using the skills he'd learned as a mechanic and the resources he'd inherited as a CEO, he'd assembled a team of engineers and environmental scientists to develop new methods for cleaning contaminated soil and water. The center's first major contract was with the EPA, helping to remediate sites damaged by Castellanos' organization and others like it. "We're not just cleaning up the messes," Jake explained to a group of visiting investors. "We're developing technologies that prevent these problems from happening in the first place. Industrial processes that don't generate toxic waste, manufacturing systems that actually improve environmental conditions, business models that prove sustainability and profitability aren't mutually exclusive." But the personal transformation had been even more dramatic than the corporate one. The shy mechanic who'd once hidden from his inheritance had become a confident leader who spoke at environmental conferences, testified before congressional committees, and inspired other young executives to prioritize ethics over easy profits. Jake Morrison was now exactly the kind of person my parents would have approved of: successful, respected, wealthy, except that he'd achieved all of it by rejecting everything they valued most. The irony wasn't lost on me when my mother called. On a Thursday evening in October. "Madison," she said, her voice carefully controlled, "your father and I have been following the news about Jake's company. We may have misjudged the situation. It was the closest thing to an apology I was likely to get from Patricia Clark." Over the past months, as Morrison Industries gained national attention and Jake became a minor celebrity in business magazines, my parents had apparently reconsidered their assessment of my unsuitable boyfriend. "We were wondering," my mother continued, "if you and Jake might join us for dinner sometime. Nothing formal, just family." I looked across our apartment. We'd moved back to Hartford but chose a place that balanced Jake's need for security with our desire for a normal life, where Jake was reviewing environmental impact reports while eating takeout Chinese food directly from the container. He still bore little resemblance to the polished executives my parents typically socialized with, but he was exactly the man I'd chosen to build a life with. "I'll talk to Jake about it," I told my mother, though I already knew what my answer would be. That conversation with my parents forced me to confront how much my own life had changed. The woman who'd once measured success by her family's approval and social standing now worked as the director of community outreach for Morrison Industries, overseeing programs that provided job training for displaced workers, environmental education for local schools, and small business loans for entrepreneurs in communities affected by industrial pollution. My job wasn't charity or public relations. It was integral to Morrison Industries' business model. Jake had discovered that companies operating with genuine community investment generated better employee loyalty, stronger customer relationships, and more sustainable long-term growth than those focused solely on profit extraction. You can't build a healthy business in an unhealthy community, Jake often said in interviews. If you're not making the places where you operate better, you're ultimately undermining your own success. This philosophy had attracted attention from unexpected quarters. Harvard Business School invited Jake to lecture on ethical leadership in crisis management. The United Nations asked him to speak at a conference on corporate environmental responsibility. 3 separate documentary filmmakers wanted to create films about Morrison Industries' transformation, but the opportunity that excited Jake most came from an unlikely source: Uncle Tony. "I've been thinking," Tony said one evening when we visited him at the garage, "maybe it's time to expand the family business." What Tony proposed was ambitious and perfectly aligned with everything Jake had learned about sustainable business practices. Morrison's Auto Shop would become the flagship location for a new chain of environmentally responsible auto repair centers. These wouldn't just fix cars. They'd retrofit vehicles for better fuel efficiency, specialize in electric vehicle maintenance, and operate using renewable energy and non-toxic materials. Every community needs honest mechanics who care about the environment, Tony explained. We could create jobs, reduce pollution, and show people that small businesses can make a big difference. Jake's eyes lit up with the same excitement I'd seen when he first talked about transforming Morrison Industries. We could use Morrison Industries' environmental technology, employ people from the job training programs, and create a business model that other communities could replicate. Within a month, they'd developed a business plan that would establish 20 Morrison Environmental Auto Centers across New England over the next 3 years. Each location would employ locally hired mechanics trained in both traditional auto repair and environmental technology, creating career pathways for people who might otherwise struggle to find stable work. The first new location opened in December, in Waterbury, Connecticut, in a neighborhood that had been economically devastated by the closure of traditional manufacturing plants. Instead of gentrifying the area, Morrison Environmental Auto Centers hired locally, bought supplies from nearby businesses, and offered services that residents could actually afford. I attended the grand opening with Jake and Tony, watching as the community celebrated not just a new business, but a demonstration that economic development could happen without displacing existing residents or ignoring environmental concerns. "This is what I always wanted to do," Jake told me as we watched Tony teach a group of local teenagers how to change oil using environmentally safe lubricants. Build something that actually helps people instead of just making money off them. But success brought new challenges, particularly for our relationship. Jake's growing prominence meant constant travel, speaking engagements, and business meetings that kept him away from home for days at a time. Our quiet evenings together became rare, replaced by corporate dinners, charity galas, and networking events where I often felt like an accessory to Jake's success rather than a partner in our shared life. The tension came to a head on New Year's Eve at a party hosted by the Connecticut governor to honor the state's most innovative businesses. Jake was receiving an award for Morrison Industries' environmental leadership, and I was expected to smile, look supportive, and make conversation with politicians and business leaders who saw me primarily as Jake Morrison's girlfriend. "I feel like I'm disappearing," I told Jake during a quiet moment on the governor's mansion balcony. 6 months ago, we were partners building something together. Now I'm just the person who accompanies you to events where everyone else gets to talk about their important work. Jake's face fell as he realized how his success had inadvertently marginalized my role in our relationship. "Madison, everything I've accomplished because of you. You're not disappearing. You're the reason any of this matters. Then why do I feel like I'm becoming one of those women who gets introduced as Jake's girlfriend Madison, instead of Madison Clark, who happens to be dating Jake? It was a fair question, and one that forced us to examine how we wanted to structure our lives going forward. Jake's success had given us opportunities most people could only dream of, but it had also created imbalances that threatened the equality that had defined our relationship from the beginning. The solution came from an unexpected conversation with Margaret Chen, who had become Morrison Industries' permanent CEO, while Jake focused on strategic development and environmental initiatives. "Have you ever considered starting your own company?" Margaret asked me during a lunch meeting where I was supposed to be discussing community outreach strategies. "Because I've been watching your work, and you're basically running a social enterprise within Morrison Industries. Why not make it independent?" The idea hadn't occurred to me, but once Margaret planted the seed, it grew quickly. Over the next several weeks, I developed a business plan for Clark Community Dynamics, a consulting firm that would help corporations implement genuine community engagement programs rather than superficial public relations efforts. My first client was Morrison Industries, but the real test came when 3 other companies, inspired by Morrison's success, asked me to help them develop similar programs. Within 6 months, Clark Community Dynamics had a waiting list of corporate clients and a small team of specialists in community development, environmental justice, and sustainable business practices. "Now, when people introduce us," Jake said, with genuine pride at a conference where we were both speaking, they have to say Jake Morrison, CEO of Morrison Industries, and Madison Clark, founder of Clark Community Dynamics. We're partners again. The balance we'd found allowed both of us to pursue our passions while supporting each other's work. Jake continued building Morrison Industries into a model for ethical business practices, while I helped other companies learn from his example. Instead of one person's success overshadowing the other, we'd created a dynamic where our individual achievements strengthened our relationship. But the most meaningful validation came from an unexpected source: my parents, Richard and Patricia. Clark finally accepted our invitation to dinner in March, exactly 1 year after I'd been kicked out of their house. They arrived at our Hartford apartment, still modest by their standards, but comfortable and genuinely ours, looking nervous and uncertain. "Your place is lovely," my mother said, though I could see her struggling to understand how we could be happy in a space smaller than their guest wing. During dinner, my father asked Jake about Morrison Industries' business model, clearly trying to understand how a company could be simultaneously profitable and socially responsible. Jake answered patiently, explaining how environmental innovation had become a competitive advantage and how employee satisfaction translated directly into better customer service and higher productivity. "I have to admit," my father said eventually, "when Madison first told us about you, I thought she was making a mistake. I couldn't understand how someone with her education and opportunities could choose, well, a different path than we'd envisioned." "And now?" I asked. "Now I realize the mistake was mine," he said quietly. "I measured success by the wrong standards. I thought prosperity meant accumulating wealth, but you two have built something much more valuable, a life that actually makes the world better." It wasn't a complete reconciliation. My parents still didn't entirely understand our choices, and there were still moments of tension around different values and priorities. But it was a beginning, an acknowledgement that love and success could be defined in ways they'd never considered. 6 months later, Jake and I stood in front of Morrison's original garage, now expanded into the headquarters for Morrison Environmental Auto Centers, preparing for the most important conversation of our relationship. "Madison," Jake said, getting down on one knee in front of the place where we'd first met. "I know this isn't the most romantic location, but this is where our story started. This is where I learned that the most important things in life aren't the ones you inherit. They're the ones you choose to build." The engagement ring was beautiful, but it was the words that mattered most. "Will you marry me?" Not because it makes financial sense or because it's what people expect, but because I can't imagine building anything meaningful without you. I said yes, of course, though the answer had been obvious since the day I'd chosen love over my parents' approval. Our wedding took place the following spring at Morrison Industries Environmental Technology Center, surrounded by the community of friends, colleagues, and family who'd supported us through every challenge. Toni Morrison walked me down the aisle since my father, despite our reconciliation, still struggled with public displays of emotion. Uncle Tony's pride was evident in every step. Jake's wedding vows summarized everything we'd learned about love, success, and what really mattered. Madison, you taught me that the most courageous thing you can do is choose to build something good, even when it costs you everything you thought you wanted. You showed me that real wealth isn't what you inherit, it's what you create with the people you love. Today, 3 years after our wedding, Morrison Industries employs over 800 people across 6 states. Clark Community Dynamics has helped 47 companies implement authentic community engagement programs. Morrison Environmental Auto Centers operates 32 locations and has trained over 300 mechanics in sustainable automotive practices. But the numbers that matter most to us are different. We've helped clean up 12 contaminated sites, provided job training for over 1,200 unemployed workers, and created a business model that dozens of other companies have replicated. We've proven that success doesn't require compromising your values. Sometimes it requires having the courage to choose them instead. My parents still don't entirely understand our choices, but they respect them. They've even started volunteering with some of Clark Community Dynamics education programs, discovering that making a difference feels better than making an impression. For Jake and me, we learned that the best things in life aren't the ones that come easily. They're the ones worth fighting for. When my parents kicked me out for dating a poor guy, they thought they were punishing me for making a bad choice. Instead, they forced me to discover that I'd made the best choice of my life. Because sometimes the person who looks like they have nothing is actually the person who has everything that matters. And sometimes getting kicked out of your old life is exactly what you need to build a new one worth living. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.